Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. Joined today with Owen and Jake. We're going to be diving into Texas A&M and Notre Dame in a few minutes. But Jake, what stands out to you from last weekend of college football?
I think it's the fact that we're never going to get a blowout in Iowa State. It's simply going to be a close game. No matter if someone I think looks markedly better than the other, or you can just throw out if someone's got a 7 or 8 point, they're a 7 or 8 point favorite. Forget about it. That game is going to go down to the wire no matter what, which makes it very entertaining. And it was truly a lot of fun to see that game.
So, Owen, did you have a chance to catch any college games last weekend?
I did. Most of the games I threw on ended up being blowouts with how the range of scores there were. I had a little bit of money because we did Ole Miss versus Kentucky last week as the preview. And I put some money on Ole Miss to cover, and they did not do that. Unfortunately, our podcast had convinced me to drop a few dollars, and that was the last time I dropped money on a team that we cover on this podcast. I'm just convinced now that I'm never going to make money off of that. But yeah, I was able to check out that game, and then Oklahoma, Michigan. I know we're talking about Oklahoma next week, but I was John Mateer hate watching, and that was a bad game to be a John Mateer hate watcher. So I'm gonna have to reevaluate my stances on him with whatever miracle work they've done over there in the QB room with at Oklahoma from his time at Washington State.
Yeah, I remember when we did the quarterback episode. We did a quarterback episode a few Wednesdays ago. And I remember you pre-show, I think, saying a few things like, yeah, you're not going to talk about Mateer very much. And then we're covering Oklahoma, Auburn next weekend. So I'm sure we will hear way more on John Mateer in 7 days. For me, what stands out, I would say there were a lot of rookies for week 1 NFL that made an impact. And then I just love watching like young college quarterbacks play. So like watching John Mateer, but also watching Bryce Underwood. I just had a lot of fun watching college football last weekend. So
it's definitely been reinvigorated for me. I was kind of last year watching college football, and maybe it was because I was working college football at the same time. It was kind of a drag to catch all his games. This year, I've been watching I got a noon slot game, I got a 3 slot game, I got a 7 o'clock slot game. Being a fan of Washington, I'm up at 11 p.m. watching them drop 70 on UC Davis. So I've been for at least for the first 2 weeks, I've watched more games through the first 2 weeks than I have like the entire last college season. Live.
You know something, Owen? That's an interesting thing, right? Because I have to remember, I've been working for a living for 30 plus years, so I have had my weekends free for a vast majority of my life. Whereas you just graduated college, and while you were in school, you were scouting for UB. So you have commitments on Saturdays. So that freedom, it's like welcome to adulthood. I'm just saying.
It's nice now. And then now with my coaching, I have games at 10 a.m. on Saturdays, and I get out of my game. I get to come home. It's about like 1 p.m. where we're in like a quarter into like the noon games, and I'm like, all right, cool. We get to sit down and relax and watch a team that I don't have to yell at to play football today.
Oh, so Texas A&M versus Notre Dame. Jake, who is your highest graded player playing in this game?
Well, I don't think it's going to come as any surprise as to who it is. It's Jeremiah Love, for sure. I think when you look at the running back class as a whole, you're probably a little underwhelmed, just maybe because of how impressive last year was, right? And, there was that possibility of both the Penn State guys going. They didn't end up doing so. Imagine if those two were not in this class either. I do feel like there is – it looks a little more shallow perhaps, but Jeremiah Love, I mean, what's there to say, really? He is the consummate professional playing the running back position, right? He isn't doing what a lot of these young guys do, bouncing out runs when it's unnecessary to do so, right? He'll get the dirty yards. He has great contact balance, right? He can kind of reduce the surface area at contact, right? He's running through arm tackles. He's lowering the pads to finish runs. He's going to let you know it's going to be a long day trying to tackle him. He is decisive. And when he, feels like there's a good opportunity to open it up, he will. He will house long runs, 70 yards, 90 yards in the playoff game against Indiana, right, to open things up, saying, yeah, I'm going to be here all day, that type of thing. And shifty as well, right? Really flexible, good reacceleration, right? And sudden, right, to adjust his path when necessary. And, when you put all that together, you get a complete running back at the position. And I think that's why NFL teams, right, who have this need of a player like this, Chicago Bears, Dallas Cowboys, two teams who are probably knocking down that door, come next April, to be looking for a player like this who can get the dirty yards, get the tough yards, do your 5-6 yard, I got to take what's given to me, and then also open things up for, 75, 80 yard house calls. Like he really can do it all in that regard.
So, Owen, where are you in Jeremiah Love?
So I learned that I'm actually rather high on Jeremiah Love because I did a Battle of the Big Boards for summer scouting with Newt over on the Weekly Huddle YouTube channel last week. And obviously, Battle of the Big Boards offense, we talked about running backs, and me and Newt both had Jeremiah Love as our number one running back. But he was looking through my overall big board, and of the 120 so players I've scouted so far, he is my number 2 overall player. Now, when throwing it through the filter of his positional value and seeing where I have them weighted, I have running backs one of the only positions on my positional value that actually loses points with their grade because of how devalued the position is. He ends up being my number 11 overall player when factoring in positional value. But for me, it's kind of all what Jake said, is that he's a player that he can house it 90 yards and has these explosive plays and can make dudes miss and can hurdle dudes. Sometimes too much if you ask some people from games previous. But he also is a guy that I pull up film of and show clips of to my running backs and I'm coaching because I'm also helping with the varsity running backs coach in my high school I'm coaching with. I pull up clips and be like, this is what we're trying to show you. Like this, watch how he is taking this inside zone and the A gap collapses and he finds the cutback lane to the correct gap. And he knows where to go with the ball with his vision, with his footwork. He's super instinctual, has a bunch of technical aspects of the game down. And he, on top of that, he brings a physical edge. When he was a lead blocker for Riley Leonard last year, putting dudes on their ass as lead blocking, finishing runs hard despite not being the biggest back in the world and still having the juice to have those 90-yard touchdowns. And my favorite anecdote from, I think it was week 1 when they played against Miami, a lot of his production didn't really primarily come from the passing game. And I felt like there was a lot of untapped potential there, which is why I'm also super high on him. And in the broadcast of watching Notre Dame versus Miami, it was like the second half started. He wasn't really getting incorporated in the game a ton. And Miami had this big lead. And the announcers came on and said, does that really take away Jeremiah Love since he's not really this receiving back? And Notre Dame proceeded to do dump off to him in the flat, design throw to him, and he was lined up as a slot receiver. Like 3 plays back to back to back, immediately following the commentators saying that, where they had him incorporate in the passing game as an essential cog. And I think that's something that NFL teams are going to look at. So for me, he's not far off from where I ended up grading Ashton Jeanty. Ashton Jeanty last year had parts of his game like athleticism where I thought there was some holdbacks, whereas Jeremiah Love, it's more so just coming around and rounding out that skill set and really putting the top tier when it comes to some of the other more technical, like really rounding out his technical game. But he has all the physical traits. He has a higher floor because of his technical running style. I'm just super in love with this player overall.
Okay, so Owen, who is your next highest graded player in Texas versus Notre Dame?
This might make, I think is it Bill that has him as wide receiver 1 with Casey Concepcion. This might make him mad because I have him. There's a big steep drop off. I have number 2 overall with Jeremiah Love, and then my next highest player in this game is a top of the second, same grade as Emeka Egbuka. I know he was a hot topic player for us every time I was on the podcast last year, but same grade as him is Casey Concepcion, the wide receiver from Texas A&M, the transfer over. He's my next highest graded guy. A lot of stuff I really like about his game. A lot of the drawbacks I've seen before, and I don't think he really does. It doesn't really live up to that for me specifically, but with his size and ability to play on the outside in the NFL and the capabilities of him to be more of a versatile receiving prospect, he has a lot of the juice, some route running. He had some questions about his hands. I I do think that there is stuff that he's able to answer this year at Texas A&M, especially in this passing game. But for me, I think he's my next highest player, and he also has the next highest probably ceiling of a lot of these players that we're looking at today.
Yeah, and it should be pointed out that Concepcion in this game is going to be playing against a couple of draft-eligible corners. So, Jake, do you like KC Concepcion better than the Notre Dame corners, like when you stack them on your board? Where do you stack the wide receiver versus corner, Texas A&M versus Notre Dame?
Yeah, I think both Devonta Smith, which is that's super fun that we have. That we should be putting him in the for the SEO for sure. But him and Christian Gray, I think there are things that they both do well, but I also think Concepcion has the ability to win this matchup. I think he had like 2.06 yards per run against man coverage last year. This year what's there to say? He's got, I believe, 3 touchdowns this year already. He was pretty much a force to be reckoned with in the UTSA game. He's got the kick return ability as well. He is explosive, and there's no question about that. And I think being that explosive, as long as you're extremely controlled as a player as well, right, and you're not kind of struggling in the through break transition game, you're not struggling when you're changing direction, right? All of these things, like if you can hone that explosiveness really well, right, you reach a level of receiver that we see in the league that handles that exceptionally well, right? I think really good examples that come to top of mind is a guy like Malik Neighbors, who's extremely explosive, extremely controlled. Brian Thomas Jr., same thing. Jamar Chase, same thing, right? Tyreek Hill has always been that type of player, right? And so if he can hone this explosiveness where he puts himself on cruise control on crossers, right? He's quick at the line of scrimmage. He can be quick to stack. He's going to eat up cushion like nobody's business. I do find him a little bit stiffer at times on the curvilinear track for me, just a little bit where it feels like he's a little stiffer than others. But it doesn't matter if he can hone that speed, especially on the vertical plane and working a lot of these crossers, right? So if he isn't extremely flexible in that regard, it's not going to, I think, hurt him too much in this matchup, because I do think he is, going to take advantage of guys who I think Christian Gray, a little bit inconsistent footwork at times. That can happen with him a little bit more in coverage. So when he's lined up against these guys who I think, both have their strengths, but both have, I think, warts to their game that Concepcion can take advantage of.
Okay. And then how do you stack up Kevin Concepcion versus the Notre Dame wide receivers? Like, how big of a gap on the board? Owen?
So it's actually not that big for me. I have on my grading scale, a 2-point difference between a Concepcion and then Greathouse is my top-rated receiver out of Notre Dame, where they play very different stylistic kind of games, and it kind of shows the broad spectrum of how these wide receivers can be graded and how they can be valued by NFL teams. When you talk about a player like Concepcion, this kind of quicker, smaller receiver, maybe more of a slot type, can get some yards at the catch, big play type of player, versus Greathouse, who he's going to hang his hat on being this bigger-bodied, run-blocking his ass off, doing the hard, nitty gritty things, and then also offering a little bit of juice after the catch type of receiver where they're going to win in a lot of different ways. But you have a guy like Concepcion who has a bit of that higher ceiling where if he can clean up some of that drops that he had from last year's tape, which he's already done so far this year, he has more of that ceiling, whereas Greathouse is a player that I think has a great floor and the NFL teams will love his skill set and what he brings as he's like an elite wide receiver 3, great wide receiver 2. If you're running more of a run heavy offense, he can be someone who can plug and play, kind of just like a locker room type of player where he goes out there, lunch pail, that all the different cliches we can throw out. He has value because of that. Whereas Concepcion specifically, even though they're closely graded, I think he has the ability to jump higher depending on what he does this year. So I like Concepcion better, and I like his trajectory better as an NFL draft prospect. But I am a big fan of specifically Greathouse from Notre Dame because of that. Kind of the intangibles and the nitty-gritty of the position he was that isn't really commonly found in more of this like diva-ist position there with wide receiver.
Jake, how about you? What's the gap between Concepcion and the Notre Dame wide receivers on your board?
Yeah, I think especially with Greathouse, I think is worth talking about for sure. Just simply because it just dominated from the slot last year. over 3.5 yards per route run against man coverage, right? He looked like the quintessential big slot, where like Concepcion, you can probably do a little bit more with him in terms of creativity, right, to hone that speed and really put stress on defenses that way. Whereas, yeah, I think Greathouse, he wins. I think the foot fire is his best release right now, where he is gaining ground off the line of scrimmage. He's not tipping his hand early, and then combine that with, as kind of Owen mentioned, how physical he can be, right? That's going to give you plenty of matchups to win in the slot. Down the field, he tracks the ball extremely well. He's great hands, right? It makes a phenomenal adjustments, can win through contact, and he's also pretty nimble as well. Like, I think he doesn't maybe get that credit because he's such a big-bodied receiver who wins in a lot of those contested spots, make little adjustments, track it, right, be reliable, but very sudden as well. I think it's decently close for me right now between the two. I would like to see how Greathouse looks more so on the boundary to get like better confirmation, because we've seen Concepcion kind of do that a little bit more to this point. But yeah, I find that there's not a massive gap, because I think both have things that you really like at the receiver position, but I think both have stuff to work on. I think Concepcion, there's some zone coverage work that I'd like to see him be a little bit better at, is kind of identifying the zone triangle, where to attack, right, and where your depth needs to be at times for routes like that. And Greathouse, I just would like to see, I think, more of the route tree, see it on the boundary. Like that would be what I'd like to see more from them. So I think both have the ability to develop, take steps forward, right, raise their floor and have a ceiling. But yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting always to talk about the contrasting styles, especially at the receiver position, because that's a different way. It's ranking that is a little trickier. But long-winded way of saying I think it's pretty close between the two.
Okay. So one of the things that I just learned, like both of you had Greathouse higher than Fields for Notre Dame, and that's Malachi Fields, the wide receiver. So when we covered Notre Dame for summer scouting, it was split 50-50, Greathouse Fields, who's the better receiver on Notre Dame. But for both of you, it's not even a question.
So I was going to continue this with going into Fields, because we kind of talked about Greathouse and we didn't really touch on Fields that much. The difference between Concepcion to Greathouse is the same amount of difference for me between Greathouse and Fields grade-wise. Whereas I have both these Notre Dame receivers in a third-round grade, whereas Concepcion I have as a second-round grade. It just more comes down to what you see as upside, where both the Notre Dame receivers are role-specific players. Like we were talking about with Greathouse, more of a supersized slot, maybe can exist on the outside more so, but he's going to win with blocking, hard work, contested catches. And it's kind of similar with Fields, where he's even bigger, 6'4", exists on the boundary, wins with bear trap hands, and in those contested catch situations has straight line, long leg kind of speed, but isn't going to be this overly dynamic wide receiver. He's not more than what you think he is. You have a good idea of what you're getting in Malachi Fields in that role you're getting, and he excels in that role specifically, but not much outside of that. So for me, Greathouse has a bit more flexibility into what he could potentially grow into, which is why I have him slightly graded higher, and because he does those still intangible things and those still like not often celebrated parts of the position, but still has some other things like some explosiveness, like some speed that he can add. The run after catch touchdowns against, I think it was Ohio State specifically, were very impressive last year in the playoffs. And so he has some of that unhidden or the hidden talent you can unlock. Whereas Concepcion, you can see a lot easier a way to creatively involve him, like Jake was saying, and he can have ways to be more of a dynamic piece to an offense, where those other two Notre Dame receivers, you're pretty good and pegged in on where you think they're going to succeed as an NFL player. Concepcion just has a greater ceiling than the other two, and I think Greathouse has a bit of a bigger ceiling than Fields does, but they both have good, solid, full floors and foundational pieces as receivers. So I can definitely see how if you have Fields above Greathouse, it's because you're banking more on his floor is better than Greathouse's floor, and not so much a ceiling factor, especially.
And Jake, you want to add your assessment of Fields as well?
Yeah, I think I think Owen did a great job of kind of painting the picture, right? I think the fact that, we get back to, 12 personnel, 13 personnel, right? You got to you can't really hide if you're going to play receiver in those sets, right? There's no hiding in the slot. Now, Greathouse might be one of those formation adjusting exceptions to that rule because of how he, can play as a blocker, right? And maybe attached to the line a little bit as we kind of talked about when I was on talking about tight ends, about like guys who, like a Puka, like a Besh, like what probably Tesla is going to, potentially be for Detroit, like these type of players where he has that sort of defined role, and maybe you don't ask him to go on the perimeter. Whereas like Fields, you've seen it already. You know that like there's some subtlety to the way he attacks in the route stem, to the way he finds space against zone coverage. So I think there's some advancement there. But in a league where bigger, faster, stronger is still happening, that kind of lack of explosiveness, right, in the short area, the lack of dynamism as a player really, to me, kind of limits what you see from him. Like, could he kind of be the guy who's the Alan Lazard, who sticks around a lot because he's, big, strong, can win above the rim, like does enough on the boundary for you? Absolutely. Where I think these other two have a little bit more of a, obviously, Concepcion a lot more, but more of a dynamic skill set where, you have that ability to accelerate in short areas. You have the ability to, kind of be the dexterity, being nimble, when you have the football, like all of that stuff where I think kind of raises the ceiling in a league that's still, when you pass, you're still, trying to stress space, for the defense. And I think Fields is going to do that just a little bit less so than the other two.
Okay. So, Jake, question on the offensive linemen in this game. So there are, by my count, just so the audience knows, we have a list of about 32 draft-eligible players in this game. The list is long. This is definitely one of the longest lists for any podcast that we'll do. There are 6 draft-eligible offensive linemen, Jake. How many of those offensive linemen do you see a day 1 or day 2 ceiling for?
Interesting. Wow. I a ceiling. That's
that was not the way I thought you were going to take that question. That's a very interesting way to attack it.
Owen, do you want to change the question? Go ahead and change the question for Jake if you need.
Well, it was more so I thought it was gonna be leading up to, because we're talking about the matchup specifically, and looking at these two different teams, and I was thinking more you were gonna direct it a bit more towards where are these players currently ranked on the board, and is that gonna be does that paint the picture of the matchup specifically with the team? I appreciate the question of who can have that ceiling, because we were just talking about ceilings and floors with these athletes on the outside and the perimeter with the wide receivers. But especially for offensive linemen, especially with some of the guys that you have in this game, you're looking at players that need to really establish themselves. I only really have one player that I have knocking on, or is it in the day 2 conversation right now with Reed Adams. And I'm relatively higher. A lot of people have him even lower than that because of some of the things that you hear them talk about with penalties and some of the leaning problems, and which again feeds into the penalties. But a lot of these players like Aamil Wagner from Notre Dame, like what is his ceiling? It's kind of harder to project, specifically because a lot of that athleticism that you can point to a wide receiver and be like, okay, he has some upside because he has that athleticism that shows up in his route running, like a KC Concepcion. You can't really point to that with tackles and guards, where like with tackles specifically, you can maybe point to it a bit more where if they can move more, you can see where they have a pathway to get a boost in their ceiling for the draft stock, but also they have to be able to weaponize that and still work within the phone booth on top of being able to move. So that's what I think makes players like Reed Adams really rare, is that like he's this 330 plus pound guard who can move in wide zone and get to the second level and dominate these smaller blockers on the second level, which is why I'm a big fan of him, because he has that kind of rare blend of it, which is why I have him as the only one really with a day 2 grade solidified at the moment. But even then, we're still talking about drawbacks, and he's still a 3rd round grade for me because there's still points that draw that back. It's not all about like that athleticism part of it. So I think he's going to be a big part with how much talent Notre Dame lost on the defensive line between Riley Mills and Howard Cross leading from the interior. They do still have pieces, obviously, on that defensive line, but there's going to be a battle between returning offensive line players who are draft eligible, like you were saying, 6 of them being draft eligible. And some of these players, like I said, with Aamil Wagner and Reed Adams, they're going to really dictate how this game is going to go. And we kind of saw that with Notre Dame versus Miami, where you had Rueben Bain across the field, and he was able to affect that game because some of these Notre Dame offensive linemen, they are draft eligible, are still kind of finding their way, both as draft prospects, but as just players currently in this college football season.
Yeah, I think the ceiling for a lot of I think the Notre Dame guys certainly have some of the ceiling to get there. Like Charles Jagusah, like he, even at guard, like he is somebody who, you developmentally want to, get him in the room because of what you see with so much of the tools, right? And the thing is, obviously he didn't have a lot of snaps last year. And so there's just not a lot to work with in terms of like, okay, what have we seen so far? Where can we project this? And it's like we kind of just have, kind of the physical profile to go off of. Now he's played a couple games, right? And this season, but he is still somebody who, or maybe he hasn't played this season yet, but like he is still somebody who like has this like ridiculous potential development track that you could see him getting into, day 1, day 2 conversations, but maybe it isn't even this year, right? And I think with Wagner, there's probably a lot of that with how it went, I guess 2 weeks ago almost now, against Rueben Bain, where it just looked like, okay, well, he's kind of maybe,
different class as a player,
right? Like this is like, okay, well, how do you go up against this, probably a day 1 talent right now, and like, okay, it's just not going well over here. But like, can we get to that development? Can we get that the best out of you for a season after, potentially, right? And so I do think like probably plenty of these guys, like even Trey, Zuhn or Zuhn, like there are a lot of these guys where you can probably, as you asked, like project them into the top 2 days, especially of the draft down the line. Is it going to be in 2026? Maybe not necessarily, but I think Reed Adams is where I would start as well when talking about this group, because he reminds me a lot of Tyler Smith at times, where he has all of the movement toolbox, right? Run game, as Owen was talking about, the run game is really good, like maybe a little inconsistent at times with the second level targets, but you see that like he can do it. Like he can get there, explosive enough, and as a mover, really great at recovery with the footwork. Whereas like Tyler Smith to me was like extremely talented and athletic, but he struggled a little bit to kind of mirror the hands with the feet. Sometimes the feet were saving him and the hands are like the hand placement was just kind of all over the place. That's what I kind of see with Reed Adams at times, where it's like his footwork can save him. And so if you have footwork that can save you, if you go to a team that's really good at developing offensive linemen, I think they can get the best out of you, like Dallas has already done with a Tyler Smith, where it's like, okay, we fixed a couple things here. We start shooting the hands quicker, right? We start getting to, inside the armpit, tight with some of these strikes. Like we're going to get a ton out of you at the next level because of what we've seen, with the movement skills, with all those tools. Like I think he brings that level of excitement when you watch him, just based on kind of that ceiling, right? And that's why he reminds me of a player who I think in a similar vein had a really, really high ceiling, coming out of the draft. And I think Dallas certainly saw something there.
Okay. So, I was trying to set up my next question, because now there's 7 draft eligible defensive linemen in this game.
Yes.
So it sounds like from an offensive line standpoint, the 6 draft eligible players I'm just going to say we're mid on them. We're not low, but we're not ready to say that these are blue chip guys. So Owen, which defensive line do you think has the edge relative to the offensive line?
So for me, that's a great question, because it depends on how this Notre Dame offensive line bounces back, right? So watching that Miami game, specifically, I watched Rueben Bain for the first time, and I threw that game on because it was already past week 1. And you're watching that game, and you can tell that the way Notre Dame started to falter in their comeback was because Rueben Bain was able to dominate Aamil Wagner so specifically. Like, I remember watching it, I forgot Aamil Wagner was the right tackle instead of the left tackle. So I'm watching, and I'm like, wow, this right tackle is just getting tossed around by this guy. And then you go back and look at my notes, I'm like, oh, Notre Dame's right tackle was Aamil Wagner, the guy I watched and graded him as like a day 3 prospect. So you look at that and you're like, okay, when I watched him previously, ignoring that game aside, because that wasn't the Aamil Wagner game I was watching, that was a Rueben Bain game I was watching. Looking back at what he did, I think that was able to kind of save him a bit from what I watched in that game specifically, where like I still went back and remembered what I did like about him, what I didn't like about him, and what I didn't like about him did show up against Rueben Bain, but also not much of what I did. And it's against top tier competition. Whereas Texas A&M, we talk about Notre Dame losing some pieces. Texas A&M lost a ton to the draft last year between both the edge room and the D tackle room with Shamar Stewart, the D tackles. Scouting at the edge, the D tackles with Shamar Turner. There's a ton of prospects they lost to that. So when it comes to what team can dominate more, you have Notre Dame that has some edge players that were there last year that are still holding over to this year. Can that continuity work better because Texas A&M and Notre Dame both still have some? These guys are still continuing coming over from like Aamil Wagner's a returning starter, Raridon is a returning starter, still playing guard where he got some spell at tackle last year. I think the continuity with A&M's offensive line is going to play well into the Notre Dame front, whereas the continuity of Notre Dame's front and offense is going to be even better against the Texas A&M defense. I think their line lost so much more when it comes to new pieces coming in and how they can replace what was left over in that scheme. So if I'm looking at just matchups specifically, I think Texas A&M's defensive line gives me more questions against a offensive line as a whole for Notre Dame as opposed to the other way around, because I do think Notre Dame's front did not have as much attrition lost to the draft as Texas A&M's did.
Jake, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right, as to where the continuity lies. I will say, if anybody can switch that around, I think Cassius Howell can certainly do that, right? I think. Yes, Texas A&M, they have a lot to replace in that room, but they might have a guy who can, like Rueben Bain, maybe just take over and kind of render the rest of the inexperience along that line moot because of how flexible, explosive he is off the edge. I think everybody saw it, right? 3 sacks in a row, doing everything you want him to do as a player, right? And I know it's not top level competition. I understand that 100%. Like, we want to see it this week. This is the week you want to see this. But win around the edge, right? Clear around the arc, bend, close with impressive speed, does all that. Next play, right? In a good position, right? Defend the run first, right? When you're on a play action, sheds the block really nicely. Something that I think he needs to, continue to do to really round out his skill set. But does that push pull. Works around him again, second sack. Then the third one, right, sets up the inside move perfectly, right, because of how explosive he is around the edge, just defeat the offensive tackle that way for the hat trick. That's the type of player who, if a guy like Aamil Wagner is not ready for that, that will surprise him. It's a little bit of a different thing. Like, Bain is a little bit more heavy-handed, right, than Howell is, right, I think we would say. So I think it presents a more interesting matchup now where it's like, okay, Aamil Wagner, like, if Howell lines up, because he obviously is lined up with left tackle, they move him around a little bit, but like when that matchup comes about on Saturday, like, are you able to kind of regain some confidence as a tackle against a player who maybe plays more speed, right, more flexibility, has a little bit more of the juice than a Rueben Bain? Like, are you prepared to kind of flip kind of what you were ready to focus on, week 1 to now, after a bye week, like against a guy who's just flat out more explosive? Like, that to me is going to be really, really interesting when he's lined up against, the guys who saw all this power and pop from a heavy-handed D line, now to seeing some true explosiveness out there.
I think that's the most important thing specifically, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that, is that it's going to be, can one dominant player overcome a continuity issue with both lines, really? But when it comes to Texas A&M's D-line, it's going to be that specifically. They have that top-end player potentially with Howell. I have a bit more faith in, not just because I've Bain graded higher than Howell in general, but I have a bit more faith in Aamil Wagner holding up against a player type-wise of Howell than a Bain, because Wagner, the whole thing around him is that he is this sub 300-pound tackle who has the athleticism, can move and sink and get deep in his arc and not allow that upward hip to be attacked. And Bane is just going to, he's, a 270, 280-pound D-end, is going to go right through your face, absolutely forklift you and get you off your feet. And that's what he did to Aamil Wagner in that game, where he was hopping on one leg and throwing him aside and dominating at the point of attack and running through his face to the quarterback. Whereas Cassius Howell, he's going to do more of that. Like, he has the inside counters, he has the inside spin, he has the push-pull rip that we saw against Rice and against UTSA. But when it comes to being able to establish that power, to make him honor that, to open up more of that outside hip, it's not going to come as natural to Howell as it did to Bane, where Bane, not being the most explosive guy, could still get some of those speed rushes going to make Wagner be honest. So Wagner's skill set, I think, plays a bit more into counteracting a player of Howell's typeage, not maybe of their level of player, but I think that game plan specifically in that talent versus talent conversation, when we're talking about draft prospects, that may be the matchup where you're going to look at Aamil Wagner to bounce back a bit as compared to what he did against Rueben just because the matchup quality was not in his favor for that game, whereas this one plays a little bit more into what he does good.
Is Cassius Howell the highest ranked edge for either team that you guys have, or is Boubacar Traore from Notre Dame close?
To me, it isn't, just because, again, I think kind of like a lot of these guys, right? You look at Traore and there's just not a lot of snaps out there, right? He has not played a lot. This is year 3 with Notre Dame. I'm looking at the snap counts, and it's 27 and then 133. Right, and I think I think Traore is still a player who is working through, not playing too high up, not, honing some more flexibility to his game, right? As a player who I think still has, plenty of, I think closing burst, right? The quicks, some of that time the flexibility is there, but I just don't think he always has it, when he's rushing the QB. He flies around. There's no question, right? He's never giving up on a play. No doubt about it. But I think I trust Howell more just because I feel like I've seen more of he can set things up and win in a few different ways, where it feels like Traore still has that refinement to him and to just technique-wise, playing lower, right? And yeah, I think there's still ceiling there, certainly, with a player like Traore, but I feel like I've seen more already with Howell than him to this point.
Yeah, and you could tie that back to their experiences. Howell was a transfer from Bowling Green, played on the A&M front. We talked about having all these draft prospects, multiple, high first-round, day 2 picks. And he still got near 500 snaps last year and had a great PFF pass rushing grade and had a lot of good stats when it came to looking at how he was being able to be productive while still being a rotational piece for the A&M line, all things considered. Whereas with Traore, he's very much the raw redshirt sophomore, needs to establish himself as a down-to-down player, whereas Howell was a down-and-out player and a dominant player at the MAC level. Then he became a rotational player at Texas A&M, and now you can see those two worlds starting to merge together, and he has that athleticism to fall back on. It gives you the upside, but he has the experience of being a player that is in against, third and shorts on being an every down edge-setting run defender. Whereas Traore, it's like, okay, he needs to put together a lot of the pieces of being a relied upon edge starting player. He has the upside. I'm not going to deny that. But it's more so, can he put that and mold it into something while also developing his floor, where he has a lot to work through right now. So I do think Howell is substantially the best player graded wise when looking at it. If the draft was, tomorrow or at the end of the season, all things standing the same, I think Howell goes significantly higher than the player like Traore or anyone else in this game being played today or tomorrow, Saturday, whatever day it is.
Today's Wednesday, the game's Saturday, but I recognize for some of us it's been a long week. I recognize that, right? Not a good day of practice. I heard that in the pre-show. And I know you like linebackers.
Love them.
Linebacker in this game do you like the best?
It's a great question. There's some, they have different roles, and specifically with their schemes. I know they always have, specifically when you're looking at these teams in their history in general, they have different ways to run their linebackers out and deploy them. So you're looking at players that they don't fit the same mold, and you're like, okay, how do I pick my favorite flavor of chocolate? And there's different, I like different kinds of chocolate. Now you're asking the brands of chocolate specifically in these different types. So it's like you got to narrow it down specifically. Especially with like A&M, who utilizes a lot of their backers in pass rush skill set. We saw guys dropping coverage from their DN specifically. I'm curious because I want to give my answer, but I also know that it's a very variety answer, and I'm curious what Jake says. And I don't want to, if I have to hit on somebody else, I don't want to take the thunder from Jake specifically. But do you have a guy specifically you're super high on?
So Jake, which linebacker do you like better?
Go ahead. No, this is, you got this. You got
and
this.
By the
You're
way,
not taking anything from me.
If the audience doesn't know, it's between Drake Bowen of Notre Dame and Terrene York from Texas A&M. I do both of you have day 2 grades on each linebacker?
I'm not going to door with them. I think they're definitely. I think I have them currently, yes, but I can definitely see a world where like some people have them a bit lower. Doesn't someone, I can't remember if there's a draft professor that has this, or I saw this somewhere else on like Twitter, have like York like specifically like high, or Bowen, one of the two are specifically high amongst the draft professors?
I think Bowen is like linebacker 2 or 3 for Bill Sparks. Bill Sparks really liked Drake Bowen from Notre Dame.
Yeah, I thought so, because he was someone that I heard the name of, and I was like, okay, he's made me interested in going to watch him that year, or going into the year specifically because of how high Bill was. It's two different, totally different players, by the way, because Bowen is 6'2", pushing 240, and then you have York, who's 5'10". I always am impartial towards the smaller backers because taking my college fame out of the way, I'm a Bills fan too, and they also operate with a lot of these smaller matchup style linebackers. So if you want a quick way to my heart, similar to how York is, where he's able to move around and be kind of this matchup fly to the ball style player, it's going to be, and then you get some bigger plays with that, like some flashier plays specifically, and you've got some things that pop for you, and you're like, okay, that guy's athleticism can make up for some of those size deficiencies, and they can really establish themselves in the NFL. And it comes then to the question of, okay, can they overcome some of the typical things that those smaller linebackers have to deal with, especially in the NFL, where these bigger offensive linemen are able to move more in space? I think York is a guy that can do that, or at least have a specific role on a defense that understands how to utilize an undersized player like that, especially with the evolution to like bigger nickel players, with teams going from spread to run heavy to spread. Now they're going back to run heavy, where you saw a transition to more of these nickel based defenses. Now there's a hybrid between like nickel base and base defense, where you're having these big nickel players, and he can be a player that even if he doesn't excel as a stack linebacker in the NFL, he can be someone who moves around and becomes kind of that more modern day NFL defender because of his size and because of his overall talents and instincts as a linebacker currently at A&M. It's just more so, can that translate to being a stack backer? Probably not with his size, but there is a role if you are able to utilize him. Kind of similar to what we talked about with some of these other linebackers that are in this draft class, where like you don't really know the best way to utilize them with how they're translated from the college game to the NFL game. But if you have a smart enough defense coordinator, you can find roles in it. If they go to the right scheme, you can fit them in. So I think for me, I'm impartial towards York just because of that specifically, and I think I can see a fancier, more creative pathway for him to make it. But Bowen being a player, and I'm kind of with Bill once he told me and I watched him, I was like, yeah, he's a really solid player. I haven't gotten too deep into the overall linebacker class, so I can't really state how high he is in my rankings specifically. But he is a player that's going to be up there when, like you said, day 2 grade, and is more of that stereotypical stack backer, 6'2", 240, able to take on blocks, stuff like that.
Jake.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing with these two is they're going to play different roles, right? There's not, Drake Bowen's going to be more of the, this is your Jack Campbell, like get downhill, like I need you to get off of blockers that are trying to get to the second level, take you out of play, steal a gap, beat an offensive lineman to a spot, but also just be physical enough, right? He doesn't have to resort necessarily to what some of these backers try to do that are kind of dipping around contact or like doing their best to try to like, okay, maintain some sort of leverage, but also know if they get contacted, they're getting thrown off the ball, like, downfield. So that's, I think, the draw to Bowen, right? Because he's bigger, and we're in, a spot in the league right now where you kind of need those guys to be bigger, right? You need players who are big, strong guys who can help out as a run defender, right? Like you absolutely need that. But also, because of how good the play action game is right now under center, you need guys like Torrey and York who can retreat quickly, get to a spot, right? Be able to close, rally and tackle, right? If you're kind of, in a defense that's trying to limit the explosive plays, right? Just fly around to the football, get to the perimeter, right? Constrict all that space that teams are trying to attack. And so I think that they're going to provide, different roles at the next level. I'm probably going to just lean towards Bowen ahead of a player like York simply because of where we are in the league. But there are certainly players who are exceptions, in terms of that size, right? You look at, everybody really likes Sean Dolak, right? Who can, out of Buffalo, like that's
Owens' guy.
That's a dude.
Just
that
so
is a dude.
That's Owens' guy.
He is a dude. Like he is the exception, right? I have a way to make this happen. And I love the shout out there with that's a sick hat also. And like,
thank
you. You have players who can get it done in at that size. It is doable. But I do think, like, again, it's just going to come down to what do you need at the position, right? What are you looking for? Are you looking for your 235, 240 pound hammer coming downhill like the Jack Campbells of the world? Or are you looking for somebody like, Edgerrin Cooper-ish, who's, maybe not taking on the blocks as much, is trying to get around them and being the guy who can run all over the place and constrict space, right? Roquan Smith's another one, kind of like, the Jack Campbells, where it's like, this is a downhill player, tackling machine, run the alley, beat players to spots, like, has the full, package of processing speed plus the physicality to boot. But again, it's just going to kind of be pick your flavor. Like, I think that is, it's difficult because we want to really like rank, the linebacker position, right, as a whole. Like, okay, how do we stack all these guys up? Where it's like, okay, well, how do we actually stack like, these middle linebackers who are like truly playing, and then how do we stack like kind of these will guys who are further away from the ball? Or as Owen mentioned, I think really well, like the big nickel. Like, is that something where some of these guys can transition there, or are they gonna, our team's gonna look at them as strong safeties perhaps? If you love a lot of the single high looks, like is that something you can transition to, right? So there is a lot of that with, I think, kind of ranking them, but also matching them with like, okay, if I want a guys for this specific role, how am I ranking these? Like maybe, 5 or 6 guys that can do that.
It's interesting. The narrative is kind of similar to where we started with wide receivers, with where you have a guy like Concepcion versus a Fields versus a Greathouse, where you're looking at floor versus ceiling, more of a traditional player. You understand what his role is versus someone who you can see the potential to add him in different spots. Where with like, if you could combine York and Bowen into one player, like that's a first round, linebacker prospect, like where you have that ability to play within space and with those spatial instincts and athleticism with that size that Bowen carries. But you have a player that has the floor with Bowen that where like no matter what happens in the league, regardless of the evolution of the game, you're going to need a downhill linebacker that stuffs to run. Like, there's never going to be a lack of demand for that supply. It depends on how much you value it, is how high it goes, but it's always going to be there. He's always going to be a drafted player. Whereas a guy like York doesn't get drafted 20, 30 years ago, or it has to straight up change positions in the draft process, kind of like how we were talking about with other, like more skill position guys, because they don't have a clearly defined role. Whereas now with the evolution of the game, we're now seeing a more defined role where you want to have good run defenders throughout your defense, even if it comes from the secondary, or like we were talking about with the big nickel. And so you can see where like he can be a modern NFL defender to help counteract what offenses are attempting to throw at defenses that have these stereotypical, like the Jack Campbells. Like with the Lions defense specifically, they have a guy like Jack Campbell. Previously, he's not like the best comparison, like Malcolm Rodriguez, another downhill type player who works inside the box. And you look at their struggles to then cover, and they added in like a safety like Brian Branch, who then can become the big nickel. I was mocking them Malachi Starks because they needed a guy like that who can be a safety corner linebacker hybrid to complement what they have. Whereas with York, that's your kind of player archetype you're looking for to complement that player. So there's also a place for these guys, but it's more high variance in where they can be utilized. And like I said, it's kind of similar to what we talked about with Concepcion versus Greathouse and Fields, where I have Concepcion graded higher because I think there's a greater probability of him being a higher impact player if you can find the offense that he fits in. Whereas with York, if you can find a defense that can utilize him properly, he has the upside to be the better player. But Bowen, you draft him, like, okay, he's my Mike linebacker. Like, he's going to go and fill, and I can then work from there. I have a proven, known commodity at that position. That's why I'm investing a day 2 pick in him. He's so high floor.
Yeah, I think that it presents a great conversation everywhere with a lot of these positions, and I think there are always exceptions, right? We talk about receivers. I love that position, and there are guys who are outliers where you can go, oh yeah, he can play X. Like, it shouldn't work, but because he's so talented, explosive release package, all of it, like a plan for contact, like he can do it without the full frame of 6'4", 220. Like he can make that happen. He can run every route in the book. Right. And so you can have linebackers who maybe they aren't 240, but they can still, figure it out, have a plan, coming downhill when they, to fit the run for contact, all of that stuff. And I think you make a great point of like what the Lions are doing, right? They're sacrificing, being able to get back, play action. Like you see Tucker Kraft win a seam route, first drive of the game for Green Bay against Detroit, where it's like, linebacker can only do so much, right? A bigger guy like that versus a really good linear athlete. So, there is some of that trade-off, and where it's like guys like York, you want to have them on the team because, you have guys in the league, Brock Bowers, right? And a lot of these tight ends, George Kittle, who, they're superb linear movers, and it's like you have to be able to get back there and try to disrupt some of these like kind of massive windows that teams are generating. Off of play action, especially.
Okay. So there's at least 3 players I still want to get to. Ironically, one of the players, like Will Lee III from Texas A&M, the cornerback, I have seen very polarizing reviews. Some people have him as corner 1 or corner 2 in the draft, and some people are like, he doesn't even make my top 10 or top 15. Oh, where are you on that spectrum?
Wow.
I'm definitely not leaning towards top of the class. I like this corner class. When I went over and covered and watched a ton of corners in preparation, I can't remember which podcast. I think we were doing top 5 with Taylor. I watched through the corners and I got to Ali, and I did like his game. I like the flashes in it, specifically when it comes to his ability with his size and movement. And you like the foundational pieces, similar to like how I was with the cornerback class last year, where there were a ton of players that you fit the profile and you have flashes of things that I do love, and that's why I have you rated more highly than some other guys. But when it comes to putting together the full picture, when it comes to transition, to having every element from ball skills to athleticism to ability to play with your eyes through the receiver, have understanding of what your responsibilities are in zone versus man, not get sucked in, and as well as playing the run, being physical, all these different elements that corners have to balance. And there are some players that you can see that are leaning one way or the other, and the top of the class guys are going to be ones that can play all of those elements together. That's why I have like a Jermon McCoy at the top, because he has that athleticism while also being physical and having ball skills. Like, he brings something to all those different categories. Whereas with Lee, I see a lot of what people are seeing. Like, I can see the path if you envision some of these other top guys not coming out, and maybe you're lower on like a Tacario Davis like I am. You can definitely see a world where he is approaching corner 1, but for me, I just couldn't get there with him specifically because I like so many more guys at the top of this class specifically.
Jake, how about you on Will Lee III?
Yeah, I think I fall more in the middle for sure. Corner is definitely one of the few positions where I've gotten, a bit deeper in terms of the class, just because the team I am a fan of, they definitely need that. They didn't draft it in April; they need it next year, and they don't have a first round pick at the moment. So, and I don't see them getting one anytime soon. So
you have Micah Parsons, though. You're
true.
okay.
We feel good. We feel great. But yeah, I think with Will Lee, I think is the interesting thing with him is like, when he's in press looks, he has kind of all the tools to handle it, right? He has the length to disrupt early. He matches well with good footwork, right? He stays kind of patient when he's out there. I think the physicality is certainly there. I think he does it too much, and it gets him into trouble, right? I think like he is somebody it's going to be interesting to see like against a player like Fields, where it's a bigger bodied guy, right? You're faster than him, but can you resist the urge at times to, when in recovery mode, grab, right? Like he gets into that mode sometimes where the penalties will catch up to him. Now, I do think like some of the like eyes on the quarterback, not, glued to a receiver stuff and zone coverage can look really good as well. I just think there are certain elements where it feels like he is a little out of control, a little undisciplined. And it's more or less like when you get further into the route for me than it is like early. And that's something that has to be cleaned up. And I think, Owen brought it up. Like Jermon McCoy, health willing somehow, impressive that he's, that he is where he is, in the recovery time. Like he is really, really impressive. Mansour Delane's had a heck of a start to the season. Guys like that, I think I'm going to be higher on than a guy like Will Lee. But a player where you're looking, again, it's so hard to tell because of the you never know who's going to declare who isn't, right? Because of NIL and all that stuff and the guaranteed money they got coming back. But like you could be looking at a guy between that sort of 45 to 75 range right now of a player who's like teams that are going to like what he brings to the table a lot. And can we coach out some of the panic, some of the grabbing that's later throughout the route, because I think there are certainly things that he does extremely well that teams are going to buy into very quickly in the process.
Okay. So, Jake, I have a question. Where do you have tight end Eli Raridon of Notre Dame and running back Jadarian Price of Notre Dame?
Jadarian Price is fun. He is fun. He is not somebody who I knew a lot about heading into the season. And then you see, Love's kind of banged up, a little bit in that Notre Dame game. At least it kind of looked that way. And where he's not getting a lot of carries. And it's like, oh, who's this guy? He's got some serious juice at the running back position. He kind of can one cut and go. And Jadarian Price is somebody who we kind of let off with this right at the top of the show of like, this running back class isn't our favorite. I think consensus would at least say that. And so a player like that who, is big enough and has enough of that suddenness and enough of that, burst through in that first 3-4 steps that can really kind of change the game is somebody I'm very, very interested in. Raridon, a little less so. I know he's, the tight end position is always a tricky one where it's like, as a blocker, I feel like I need to see more. And yet when I look at that and I'm like, okay, as a blocker, I need to see more. I'm like, okay, he's a really good receiver then. He must have, plenty of production at receiver. And as a receiving tight end, he really doesn't to this point. And so that's, a little bit shocking to me where it's kind of like, okay, I need something. I need one of the two phases. Like give me a little bit more in both of those areas, or at least one where like I can see more, because I know we had our big, tight end ranking show. He was not amongst my list because again, we kind of talked about, some of these guys that are really good receiving options. And then, for me, like guys like Delp and Sadiq, especially, who has kind of just, become, just buying in as a blocker. Right. So I really want to see him, kind of figure out like, okay, where do you belong right now? Where are you going to do the most damage at that position? So for now, I not as interested, but obviously will be in this game. It's a high profile matchup, but certainly in on a player like Price who has some of that game changing ability.
Owen, how about you on Price and Raridon?
Yeah, I think I lean more if like comparing them as like who do I like a bit more when it comes to as a prospect or when projecting them forward, because neither guy did, or at least Price doesn't need to come out right away, especially if he's going to have an opportunity to take over for Love next year. So like because Raridon has to come out as a senior, but for Price being a junior, he can stay another season, especially if Love is projected to leave, which I'm sure he will. You could see a role where he develops into being the lead back because he's kind of like Jeremiah Love light, where he has that size, 5'11", 210 plus, having that explosiveness, and you can see a pathway where Notre Dame would also especially love if he came back, and because he played in on a team in Notre Dame where he had 107 snaps year one, 302 year two, and then only 15 in that first game. He still has a lot of tread left in the tires, so even though he's an older player, it may not impact him nearly as much if he stays and then becomes a lead back as opposed to whatever he can get the scraps of from Julian Love this year. And looking at his draft stock, how that impacts it, he could stay another year, take over that lead role at Notre Dame, where they just had a player in my projections for Julian Love going in the first round. And then you're looking at the kind of heir apparent guy who steps out of the Julian Love shadow and takes over. So for me, when projecting out a player versus like Raridon for this year's draft versus Price for, I'd assume, next year's draft, I think with Price, the skill set and the athletic ability is there a bit more when it comes to projecting him to get higher up in his rankings. Whereas Raridon, I think you definitely need to see, especially with tight ends. Tight ends are so interesting for me as rookies or as like potential players to be drafted, because if you're not like a super dominant player at blocking in college, sometimes it can negatively impact your draft grade specifically, because it's like, okay, you couldn't do it there. How can we trust you to develop it more in the NFL? Versus, okay, well, we already know you're going to struggle to develop in the NFL anyway, so we're going to try to work you from scratch. Do you at least have some explosiveness and ability to be a receiving threat now? And that's not what we have to bank on teaching you. You can fall back on that, which is why I like a player like Eli Stower so much, because like he shows the want and grit to block and has that athletic profile, but he's not the best blocker in the world. He's not able to size up and really be a technical blocker, but he has the fallback of athleticism, and then you can always coach him up there. So for me, Raridon, I don't know if he has that top end ability to not have teams question whether or not they can actually utilize him well, or then focus their efforts in the right areas. Whereas with Price, you look at, and again, limited action, he has the ability to then step in and be like, okay, this is the guy we're talking about, is one, like, day 2, early day 3 back that has where right now it's like he's kind of an unknown. Maybe take a swing on him in the 7th because he has some athletic upside, but like you really don't know what you're getting with him as an overall player, especially not as a starting running back.
Okay. So we've gone the entire game preview. We haven't discussed the quarterbacks yet. So I was watching the Notre Dame Miami game live. I was thoroughly entertained. For that to be Carr's first start, he seemed a little shaky early. But that game was not too big for him, for that being his first start. So I was really impressed with Carr. But Jake, do you have anything on either quarterback in this matchup?
Not a whole lot. I know, yeah, because obviously CJ Carr, we haven't seen a lot from him yet. But like, yeah, I think that's tough. This is your first start. This is a high-profile matchup, right? This is a Miami team that's got the idea of hey, these guys were the national championship last year. Let's take it to them a little bit, where it's like, yeah, okay, first start, you're going to get pretty rattled. That's totally understandable. Arch Manning certainly had it as well, so he's not like he's not like alone in his struggles early week 1, right? But as far as Reed, if I remember correctly, he's got I think. Right, he's, again, if this is who I'm thinking of, I don't have a lot of him other than I think last year it was kind of, for him, very much like do as much as you can off script, right? Be an athlete out there more so than taking over as a QB. If this is the guy I'm thinking of, in Reed, where it was, I definitely remember all the talk last year of this is dynamic presence. It feels like there's just more juice than what they were rolling out previously. But other than knowing he's got some of that playmaking ability, I don't have a big handle on how he's done. Within structure, reads, processing, how quick it can go. But I know there is, athletic tools there.
Yeah, and I probably should have given a disclaimer before I pivoted to you is that neither quarterback in this game is draft eligible. But if we're doing a game preview, we should probably talk about the quarterbacks a little bit. So, Owen, what did you have on CJ Carr?
Well, I do believe, just to interject with that, I think Reed is draft eligible because this is his third year for A&M because he played 74 snaps in 23 and then played 625 last year. And then this is his third year now at A&M. So I think he could technically, he's in the same class as a Sellers, redshirt sophomore. So he could technically come out, but he definitely, you're not, I'll go with Carr first. So for me, Carr was the biggest X factor for me for that game. I remember talking to some of my coaching buddies before we got home from practice that day, talking about that game specifically. And I kept saying, it's going to come down to this redshirt freshman quarterback stepping in. Game one, Miami, one of the high-ranked teams. You go against Rueben Bain, who ended up making a big impact in that game. You need to step in, and this is a big moment for you. And while I think you saw the inexperience, I don't think he ever lived down from the moment specifically. One play that stood out to me specifically was that touchdown where they were running the quarterback rollout after the play action. And whether it was because he turned the wrong way or the running backs kind of misinterpreted where they were supposed to be going with their landmarks, they ran into each other. And he was able to recover that and still make a play to score a touchdown in a tight game where they needed him to make some plays. And it felt like the moment wasn't too big for him. It's a week one game where you were in that your team was in the national championship. You were redshirt the last year during that. You were a first front row witness to that. But even then, coming into playing is a totally different beast against a high-ranked team. I don't think that stage was too bright for him as such a young player. So I don't think his mechanics or his a bunch of the stuff that you're looking for when it comes to as a draft prospect they're far off. And I don't think they're going to be something that we're going to be talking about for at least a few years. And with him, he actually can't commit this year. So there's no way to even really focus on that. It's really more so for me, especially with one game in his career, how did he hand up mentally? Was he had mental toughness? Was he able to adapt? And how did he feel being a quarterback at a Power 4 school in a big spot like that? And I think he really kind of checked some boxes for me there. So I think if he can continue to develop his mechanics and some of those other more natural quarterbacking stylistically things that where he can be more comfortable as an NFL true prospect quarterback, then we can start talking about him in the future as a guy that can move forward with that. So I felt like that was something that I really did like. With Reed, Jake, you're not mistaken. And even to start this season, he's been very similar to how he was in 24, where against UTSA and against Utah State, it was make a ton of plays off script, see the receiver open, hell of an arm, absolutely rips it, and can move. And it's more so controlled chaos with him at quarterback and his true dropbacks. They obviously utilize his legs a lot, and they allow him to make plays off script and utilize that in their offense, which makes them a bit more dynamic than they were with a Connor Weigman under center last year. But you're still getting some of the turnovers in there, but you're not sacrificing as much because you have more high-end talent when it comes to athleticism and arm strength than you got from a Weigman. So I think when it comes down to this quarterback competition, or quarterback matchup in this game, it's the underexperienced, kind of raw, redshirt freshman quarterback who may be able to have the poise to sit in and play against a team like A&M versus the super dynamic, more experienced player, experienced in quotation marks because he's still nearly as raw as a player like a Carr is because he doesn't have to really refine a lot of his stuff. He's able to go out there and play his style, and it works effectively for what A&M wants. So as draft prospects, I'm not really interested in either of that at the moment, but when it comes to a fun college football game, I think between Carr stepping in, showing he can rebound from that loss against Miami and showing some more of that big play, big game type attitude versus Reed, who's just going to run all over the barn and it's going to be a fun watch, regardless of whether or not he's making the plays or he's turning the ball over.
Okay. So why don't we pause? Jake, do you want to let everybody know about all of the content you make and how to follow you and all of that other great thing?
Yeah, for sure. On Twitter, you can follow me at Jake NFL Draft. If you search Jake NFL Draft, no spaces, on YouTube, you will find all the content I do over there. Plenty of film rooms, more skewed wide receiver, just because I feel like that's the most comfortable breaking down on a platform like that. But there's a lot of draft over there as well. And then a little bit of Substack stuff, which is, again, a lot more slanted to receiver, but it's plenty on the draft. So I do a lot of that there. But if you go to at Jake NFL Draft on Twitter, you will find both of those links.
Good. Oh,
yeah, and you can find me also on Twitter at Weekly Huddle, but also over on YouTube at Weekly Huddle YouTube channel, where I post a ton of different content. I had just recently, we did it over an hour. Me and Newt West, another draft professor, did our Battle of the Big Boards offense. We're planning to do another Battle of the Big Boards defense, kind of combining our early season watches as well as our summer scouting process, which Newt posted all of his top 10 player watches on my channel over the summer. So you already have a kind of a look at what he does, and I'm going to bring my board and we'll kind of butt heads a bit, which was what we're usually good at with this channel, with this show. But other than that, I also post, I'm doing a series this year, this fall, and I have to record actually episode 2 either tonight or tomorrow, where I'm trying to win a fantasy football league with just an all rookie team. Jim is actually in that league as well. Lost by 3 points week 1. So close. If Cam Ward scored anything more than 3 points, I probably would have won that game. I went into Monday Night Football up 3 with the other guy only having DJ Moore left, and I lost. Ended up losing by like 3 or 4. So real close. Promising. Again, if Cam Ward can score more than 3 points fantasy-wise, I think I take that one, and we're off to a 1-0 record. But I'm going to have weekly updates with that, talking about reviewing it, really kind of looking at these rookies and players we've talked about in this process up to this point and through a different lens. And as well as I'm streaming live. I just went live the other day on YouTube doing some live watch-alongs for players. I watched the Cincinnati tackle, Dante Corleone, and because YouTube doesn't like to have film up, I have to download those and they get posted over on my Patreon. The Weekly Huddle is also the Patreon name over there as well. So if you want to catch those VODs, as well as get access to my big board and other player profiles, you can check that out over on Patreon.
so welcome to the Draft Professor. If you haven't caught any of our podcasts before, we're here every day. I want to give a special shout out to Owen. Owen was podcasting twice a week in the summer, kept the channel going. We have daily draft content, 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern every day. Over the summer, we had a few draft professors that were doubling up. Definitely want to give a shout out to Owen for helping out with that. But I also want to give a shout out to Owen and Jake because they're here keeping Wednesday nights. Like, we have great matchups. So next weekend on this podcast, we're covering Auburn, Oklahoma. We're getting some high-ranked prospects. It's going to be a big SEC matchup. That should be a fun discussion. So as we're going through the season, in October, Owen will be with Newt. So we're going to switch Jake out with another Green Bay Packers fan and Owen and Newt to break down the defensive line class. And you'll see Jake pop up on another night on the Draft Professor. But we're here every day. We cover the draft every day, 5 days a week, 2 shows a night. And then we have a show on Saturday and a show on Sunday as well. So if you like the draft and you can go to YouTube and hit that subscribe, that would really be appreciated by everybody on the channel. There are 24 people like Jake and Owen that show up once a week so we can put out the content. We couldn't do this without Jake and Owen, so please give them a follow. Okay? You can follow the channel at NFL Draft Fanatic, no I in Fanatic. It's the same on X as it is on YouTube. You can also catch the podcast on Spotify. With that being said, we have been going for a long time. Texas A&M and Notre Dame have a lot of players. We didn't even cover them all. We covered most, but we did not cover them all the draft eligible players. So for Owen, Jake, myself, the 94 podcasters at the Draft Professor, thank you so much for stopping by. It's been a blast. We'll see you on a podcast again tomorrow night. Thanks, everybody.